If you're like me, you probably have a game that holds a special place in your heart, something you remember fondly, and find yourself thinking about or referencing. Whether that game fills you with nostalgia, prompts you to think about things in a different light, or otherwise impacts you, it is a completely special experience that you will never forget. For me, that game is Final Fantasy VI. From the life infused into the characters, the iconic masterpiece of a soundtrack from longtime franchise composer Nobuo Uematsu, or perhaps the dancing of a madman that doesn't like to wait, this game is the epitome of something special. As with all of my reviews, I do my best to be as impartial as I can, but during this one I make no promises. And with that disclaimer and lengthy intro out of the way, let us get swallowed up as we seek a zone of retrospective for the last entry of the franchise during the Super Nintendo era. Final Fantasy VI was released on April 2nd, 1994 in Japan, and then as Final Fantasy III in the US on October 11th of the same year. After this title, the numbered entries will finally line up throughout regions, so don't worry if you're still confused. You have a pass until the next one. Final Fantasy VI's development began just after the release of Final Fantasy V, and, amazingly, only took a year to complete. Franchise founder Hironobu Sakaguchi would not be as involved as previous installments due to his promotion to executive vice president of the company in 1991. Because of this, Sakaguchi opted to take on the role as a producer and split the director role between Yoshinori Katase and Hiroyuki Ito. Splitting up the responsibilities would be the catalyst of change that would forever shape the franchise going forward. Katase was in charge of the production and story, whereas Ito handled everything related to the battle system. Due to Katase being laser-focused on the story, the focal point of Final Fantasy VI is the characters. In fact, the main idea during production is that every character would be the protagonist. In an effort to give each character their own motives and personality, all members of the development team were encouraged to contribute ideas for the character and the overall plot, which Katase would refer to as a hybrid process. This is why the game's characters are so varied and unique, not only in their stories, but also in their abilities. By the time Final Fantasy VI was released, the Super Nintendo's Mode 7 graphics had already been utilized in several games. However, this game would use them much more extensively. Mode 7 is notably recognized in the iconic opening sequence. The Magisite armor marching towards the city of Narshe as the credits roll and with the world map, giving it a pseudo 3D effect to an otherwise 2D game. In my opinion, the sprite work for Final Fantasy VI is easily some of the best that the 16-bit era has to offer. The parallax backgrounds and special effects for the spells, fog, and weather effects easily make this one of the most impressive looking games on the Super Nintendo. Speaking of graphics, the localization practices in the West would show themselves once again, with quite a few changes here between the American and the Japanese releases. The usual suspects are here, with the level of nudity and some sprites being changed for the North American release, as shown here. On the left, we have the original Japanese sprite for Siren, all buns out, espers out. In the middle, the Western release, and on the right, we have the Western GBA release that would come out later. The bar signs from the original have been replaced with a cafe sign. A large part of localization during this era of gaming for Nintendo was to change anything gratuitous in regards to depiction of violence. The phrase, "go kill them," during the Siege of Figaro early in the game was changed to, "go get them." Also during the same scene, "then they can burn to death," was replaced with, "then welcome to my barbecue." The translation was once again done by Ted Woosley, who is notorious for his translations. For instance, as the heroes ride away on the chocobos, Kefka swears in Japanese, but this would be translated to "son of a submariner." Religious allusions would either be omitted or renamed, as was done with the Holy Spell renaming it to Pearl. Returning for the third time is the ATB system, allowing for quick actions and execution. Instead of a job system as was present in Final Fantasy V, now each of the main characters have a unique skill to use in combat. For instance, Sabin, the martial artist, can literally pummel, suplex, or bum rush your opponents into submission. Edgar has a variety of tools at his disposal, including a literal chainsaw to slice up your foes. There's also 𝐂𝐎𝐍 that can spend time amongst the enemies on the veldt to learn their skills, while Strago works as a blue mage, and so forth with the rest of the cast. Most of the characters' skills are amazing and feel great. Well, that is until the last half of the game, where the character skills are dwarfed by magic. Magic is not particularly available in the beginning of the game except for specific characters having narrative access, like with Terra or Celeste. During the second half of the game, however, magic becomes available for all characters and completely dwarfs the skills that made those characters unique. Why would someone want to use Bum Rush that could do up to 9,999 damage to one target when they could cast Ultima and do the same amount of damage to all targets? There is a particularly overpowered relic called the Gem Box, or Soul of Thamasa, that allows the caster to cast 2 spells per turn. Pair this with Gogo's Mimic ability, and now you have 4 Ultima casts in 2 turns. Last time I checked, there also isn't a single boss that is weak against physical attacks, but there are many that are weak to specific elements. This isn't to say that there aren't ways to make physical damage builds effective as well, such as using the Offering Relic and the Genji Glove. It is just that in order to do so, it requires more planning. I love Final Fantasy VI, and on most days I would say that it is my favorite in the franchise. However, without self-imposed limitations on skills or playstyles, Final Fantasy VI is one of the easiest in the franchise to complete. Now before I move on, I wanted to elaborate on how learning magic works. As you progress through the game and collect different pieces of Magisite, equipping them to different characters will allow them to learn specific spells at a certain rate. When you complete a battle, you earn Magic XP, otherwise known as Magic AP. Magic AP is multiplied by the rate attached to the spell to get a percentage towards mastering it. For instance, if you have a spell with a 9% modifier and earn 2 Magic AP from a battle, after multiplying, you would be at 18% towards learning that spell. Once you reach 100%, that character has forever learned the new magic. Another aspect that Magisite has that I didn't understand when I first played the game as a kid is how they increase your stats on level up. So if you wanted to increase strength so that your physical attacks do more damage, you would want to have a Magisite equipped that has a strength bonus at the time when the character levels up. Without Magisite, all the character gains at level up are HP and MP, with the exception of Terra and Celeste, due to narrative reasons. So if you feel like doing the infamous Leet River technique to grind levels, your characters will technically be weaker if you played the game normally, as at this point in the game you don't have Magisite access yet. Personally, I like to get the Cursed Shield, then grind on the veldt. Not only do I uncurse the shield, but I also get 𝐂𝐎𝐍 Rages, even though he's a character that I seldom use. I sometimes get the completionist bug too, and with this game it is no different. A new mechanic introduced in Final Fantasy VI is splitting the entire team of characters into multiple parties that you can switch in between and separately use in dungeons or scripted scenarios. Now, Final Fantasy V dabbled with this, with a couple of its dungeons having you split the party into groups of 2. Final Fantasy VI takes this to the new level. There are several instances of multiple party dungeons in the game, including a 3-party split at the end of the game to traverse the final dungeon. Now, this mechanic has pros and cons. The upside is it requires the player to think of the dungeon path as non-linear, constantly considering how if one party is stepping on a switch or moving in a specific way, how will that impact the ability for the other party to progress through the dungeon? Now, the downside to having multiple parties is that on a first-time playthrough specifically, the player may feel overwhelmed at having to utilize or grind up XP so that they can have 2 parties that are strong enough to contend with the foes that they face. The grind can especially feel vicious in the event that the player has not found enough characters to constitute 3 or even 2 full parties after a specific event partway through the game. Something I haven't really discussed in prior reviews, but I feel is pertinent enough to mention, is that in the original release of Final Fantasy VI, it is buggy as all get out. From the well-known easy mode of casting Vanish and then Doom, a combo that is lethal to almost every single enemy in the game, to the lesser-known Evade bug, in which the Magic Evade stat actually governs your character's ability to dodge both physical and magical effects. Now, due to how the Evade bug is coded, it also renders the Darkness status effect ineffective. So if you're playing with the original Super Nintendo version and someone gets blinded, it isn't difficult to just deal with it. Sketch was also broken to the point that it could corrupt your save files or possibly overwrite a bunch of your items and turn them into rare items like Ragnarok swords, curse shields, or other things. If you're playing versions that came out later like the Game Boy Advanced or the Pixel Remaster version, the bugs have then since been squashed. Now, typically with my reviews, I attempt to avoid story spoilers where possible, but due to the nature of this game in particular, we'll be speaking quite a bit about the characters and the story. So if you wish to avoid anything story related, I would recommend that you go to this timestamp right here. So 3, 2, 1, okay, you've been warned. So as I alluded to this earlier, Final Fantasy VI's greatest strength is its characters and its story. A unique aspect of this game, not only for its time, but surprisingly enough, for the genre in general, is that almost every one of the playable 14 characters is given their own time to further develop their character arcs and stories through flashbacks and side quests. For instance, Terra at one point loses her will to fight, feeling like she has never felt love, and feels as though there is nothing worth fighting for. Locke continues to explore the world looking for a way to bring back Rachel, whom he loved and felt responsible for, which causes him to look after Celeste and eventually cultivate feelings for her. Even Shadow has a storyline that is revealed by sleeping through various beds throughout the world that explains a lot as to why his character acts the way that he does, and why his dog appears to be quite fond of Realm. Now, I could of course speak upon all of these characters and stories for quite some time, but in the interest of keeping this review to under 3 hours, I'll focus more on the central theme of the game. At its core, Final Fantasy VI is a game about loss and how different personalities will suffer or adapt to it. Almost every single playable character in the game experiences some sort of loss prior to the events of the story at the start of the game. As you probably already know if you're viewing the spoiler section, the climax of the first half of the game culminates with the main antagonist Kefka betraying Emperor Gestal and forces the world into ruin. In a unique twist on the formula, Kefka is actually able to accomplish his goal of destroying the world. Where most villains talk the talk, Kefka walks the walk. And as the game says, on that day, the world was changed forever. Now, speaking of Mr. Palazzo, my good friend Travesty and I had a great discussion about our favorite dancing mad lad. I always felt that one of the big parts of Final Fantasy VI was the lacking of backstory for Kefka. How did Kefka rise into power? Why was Kefka allowed to stay around for as long as he had? I totally get being evil for evil's sake, but I know that if I had someone who worked under me that constantly did the things that Kefka did by undermining my authority, I wouldn't keep him around. Now, Travesty enlightened me and put it best when he said that Kefka was the kind of guy that just gets stuff done. You would send him in to accomplish a goal. It may not be pretty, as shown in how he handles Doma, but you would rather deal with the consequences of his actions than with the problem itself. Kefka was like the knife in the dark that the Empire used. And as the saying goes, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. Kefka's value outweighed his risk. A side note, I wanted to take a brief moment to highlight Travesty's efforts, as he is an instrumental part of getting these reviews done. He helps me with my script writing, so if you hate the reviews, make sure that you let him know in the comments. Just joking, but seriously though, know that he does help me get these out, and if you see him hanging out in my stream chat or something, just shoot him a kudos, because he really deserves it. Now, continuing with the more mature tone of Final Fantasy VI, the game tackles some various serious themes that I personally hadn't seen in video gaming prior to or rarely after. For instance, the couple that Terra is helping in the world of Ruin, Dwayne and Katarine, were teen lovers in a city named Mobliz in the world of Balance. And with the world being all but destroyed, they symbolize the difficulties of keeping a love alive in the face of tragedy. Through interactions with Terra, Dwayne would have to overcome feelings of abandonment and the stress of taking care of children before you feel ready. But he would also set an example for Terra that would open her eyes to what love and self-sacrifice really mean. In the end, this side story comes to a conclusion with Terra being shown the strength that comes from fighting for love, the couple vowing to do all that they can for one another, and the children they, adopted, and Terra rejoining the player's party. Another example of mature themes comes when the player first enters the world of Ruin, and Celeste deals with the gravitas of not only losing the battle with Kefka, the destruction of the world, but also, if the player doesn't properly intervene, the loss of Cid. The events of Celeste having lost everything and presumably stranded alone on an island with nothing left to live for, causes her to fall into a deep depression, and eventually, she leaps off of a cliff attempting suicide. I think that we have all thought at one time or another that there was nothing that we could do to better our situation, and that all we wanted was a break from the ceaseless onslaught of bad news or bad situations. The way that the game not only presents these bleak tones, but gives examples of how to overcome these mental demons is a testament to the writers taking the time to craft a hopeful message in a time of despair. Despite having some of the darkest themes in the franchise to date, the entirety of Final Fantasy VI isn't all gloom and doom. Juxtaposed with the emotionally heavy tone of the majority of the game are numerous moments of levity. Whether it be Kefka mentioning that he doesn't look like a waiter, or Cyan being referred to as Mr. Thou, Final Fantasy VI has a plethora of moments designed to break up the heavier portions of the game. For instance, just after the events of Doma Castle, where Cyan's wife and child are poisoned by Kefka, we're introduced to Gao, which, personally, I just take my frustrations out by beating the crap out of him on the veldt, but, that's just me. Until finally giving him some dried meat, which leads to a humorous exchange to get him to join the party. Several times throughout the game, the party is assaulted by Ultros, a humorous octopus that, outside of perhaps the first encounter, poses little threat to the player, and is even used as a brief tutorial into how Realm's sketchability works. Another moment of humor wedged into an otherwise emotional scene is when Locke is seasick while Terra and General Leo are speaking about what it is to love someone or something. One of the best parts in the dichotomy of lighthearted and dreary is that neither one feels like it overstays its welcome for too long. Okay, this next topic is impossible for me to not be nostalgic and subjective towards, and that is the music. Final Fantasy VI is the first game that I distinctly remember the composer using the musical device known as a leitmotif. Every character not only has their own theme, but there are variations of the theme throughout the game to depict what is happening. For instance, Edgar and Sabin's theme have a completely different connotation when it is played in his flashback of how he became King of Figaro. Terra's theme is reused as the overworld theme, and not only is this piece instantly recognizable to anyone who has played the game, it is the first piece that I personally learned how to play on the piano almost 30 years ago. In fact, I personally attribute Final Fantasy VI and the musical genius that is Nobuo Uematsu as the reason that I got so deeply into music in the first place. I would be remiss, however, if I did not mention one of the most iconic pieces of music, Aria de Mezzo Caratore, which translates to air of half character in Italian. This piece plays at a pivotal point in the plot. As the party is attempting to get an airship and Celeste is having to impersonate an actress in an opera, this moment is so emotional because it is easy to forget that Celeste in this moment is meant to be acting. The tension between her and Locke can be cut with a knife. Although it would take some future events to finalize the inevitable love story, the warming of Celeste's cold exterior begins at this very moment. This scene is a perfect microcosm of the experience we got playing Final Fantasy VI. The trifecta of how masterful writing, music, and story culminate together to create an emotionally charged moment that is greater than the sum of its parts. There would be many games after this one that would hit on one or two of the three pillars, but I cannot think of a single game that delivers on the total package as well as Final Fantasy VI. For choosing a track in particular to remix for this one, as there are just too many good tracks, I chose several. One of which being the Magitech Factory, which I have titled Magitechnological. I've also redone the Blackjack theme with Flying Free. And what Final Fantasy album wouldn't be complete without the Prelude remix? With that being said, as of April 21st, which is the date that this video is coming out on, the first volume of the Final Fantasy remix tracks are available. There are links in the description below to go ahead and check that out. You can listen to the entire thing via Spotify, YouTube, Bandcamp. There's probably about a million other things, but I'll leave those links in the description below, as opposed to putting samples of each of these songs like I typically do in these videos. Now, while Final Fantasy VI would not prove to be the commercial success in the West that Squaresoft wanted, that would come later with a future entry, it did lay down the blueprint of what the franchise would be going forward. Now, in the future, the heartbeat of the franchise will be in the characters and the story. Although there will be many changes to gameplay, the foundation of every game will be built upon these two pillars. Now, having the focus be on the story and characters creates an interesting division. Either you love the story and therefore you love the game, or you have trouble relating to it and the game doesn't resonate with you. Personally, I play Final Fantasy games for the story, so when the story is something I enjoy, I tend to really love the game. However, when the story bores me, or it isn't engaging enough, I typically feel no desire to replay it. So does Final Fantasy VI hold up today? Yes, it definitely does. Just like Final Fantasy V review, all versions of this game still hold up great. I will offer a small warning about the Anthologies version on the PlayStation though, as there are additional loading times for all of the fights. It's not a deal breaker, but it's something that you should know going into it if you decide that that's the version that you want to play. The Game Boy Advance version also has additional dungeons that were added, so if you want more content, that is probably the best one to play. However, it doesn't look or sound quite as nice or as good as the other versions, so you gotta give and you gotta take with that one. Now, this game will always have a special place for me. At moments in my life when it feels as though my world is plunging into ruin, I'm thankful for my ability to make music, which this game inspired me to pursue. I would once again like to thank all of my Patreon supporters, as you guys are the only reason that I'm able to keep this series going. If you'd like to further support the channel outside of the liking, subscribing, or sharing this video, consider becoming a patron to access music as I write it, prior to the release or to the general public. Or possibly having your name as one of the nameable things in our live playthroughs on Twitch and YouTube channels. Now, the next game we will cover in the series is another one of my favorites in the franchise, as it levels up to a new platform and publisher. So next time, my fellow returners, praise be to Yevon.